Good afternoon. My name is Chris Leak, and I'm the chair of the City County Planning Board. And now I'm going to call our June 24th, 2021 virtual work session to order. We're going to turn this over to Mr. Kirk Erickson, our Assistant Planning Director, to call the roll, please.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. George Bryan.
Here.
Melinda Dunnigan.
Here.
Walter Farabee. I see Walter, so we'll count that as.
I'm here.
Thank you,
I got
sir.
it. You need some caffeine.
Jason Grubbs. Not seeing Jason yet, but we expect him to pop in a few minutes here. Clarence Lamb.
Here.
Chris Leak.
Here.
Mo McRae.
Here.
Brenda Smith.
Here.
Thank you. And Jack Steelman.
Here.
All right. Well, that is the roll. And Mr. Chairman, would you like me to introduce the first agenda item?
Yes, please. If you will go on and proceed.
All right. Thank you, sir. So the first item on the board's agenda today is continued discussions on UDOC C11, which is a text amendment related to storage services retail. The board will recall that this was an item where you all had the public hearing at your June public meeting. You went ahead and closed that public meeting and then into work session, at which point Mr. Bryan actually made a motion and introduced some alternative language. The board discussed that a little bit and decided they'd like to further discuss that item at this meeting. So what I'll go ahead and do is turn things over to Tiffany White. She's actually typed up Mr. Bryan's language, and she'll go ahead and compare that with the original staff proposal, and then we'll let the board continue its discussion on it. Tiffany?
Thanks, Kirk. Hello, everyone. I am going to start sharing my screen here. All right. I am here to talk about UDOC C11 and our continued discussion from the June 10th, 2021 public hearing. This is just a recap of what Kirk just told you. We presented this at your June 10th planning board meeting. You held and closed the public hearing and began discussing the draft ordinance. After the initial discussion, the board moved to continue this item to the June work session to consider alternative ordinance language proposed by George Bryan. This language was sent to you in advance of this meeting, and I have prepared a comparison of the draft ordinance language and the proposed modifications for your review. I will go through each of these sections, and then I will be open for questions and discussion at the end. So the first section that had proposed changes was section B3. This is in the area under standards for internal access. The draft ordinance that staff prepared talked about the facades greater than 100 feet in linear length shall be articulated with recesses and projections, which total at least 25% of that facade's length, and no uninterrupted length of any facade shall exceed 75 horizontal feet. George's proposed language, you can see in yellow, that facades should be compatible in scale and rhythm with surrounding structures, and if not held to another standard by surrounding structures, the original language would apply. The next section that had proposed modifications was in section B6. Again, this is in the standards for internal access. This has to do with the PB district, allowing storage services retail. The proposed changes would that these standards be in the PB and LB districts that we were proposing for inclusion of storage services retail. Section B6A, we had proposed that the PB district require a planning board review, and George's proposal was that PB and LB district require special use permit from the elected body. Finally, section B6B, this had to do again with the PB district, that the street level of these buildings, which front a public right-of-way, should incorporate non-residential uses allowed in the district adjacent to the right-of-way, and that the non-residential uses must occupy at least 50% of the interior space. Again, the proposed changes in yellow would add the language that additional non-storage related non-residential uses be adjacent to that right of way. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Those were the proposed changes as brought forward by Mr. Bryan, and I am happy to answer any questions that you might have for staff.
Tiffany, I have a question for you.
Sure.
And this applies to both versions, and it's one that I had, from reading the ordinance from the beginning, and I never did get this question answered, but it really goes to the chart that you've provided, the use chart.
Sure.
I had a hard time interpreting that. It just didn't seem right to me. Maybe I'm reading it incorrectly. So if you could go over that chart and explain how to read that to us.
You're talking about the use table chart that allows the district.
Yes,
Sure.
yes.
So the use that, because we recommend splitting the storage service retail use into internal and external storage, you could see that the use as described shows the external, which is a high, and the internal, which is a low. So those two lines follow across and show the zoning districts that would allow the internal and external access buildings. So there are two rows there that go along.
Mm-hmm.
So for the external access, which is the top line, those zoning districts include HB, GB, LI, GI, and that looks like an E. So all of the zoning districts that it was allowed in originally. Not E, I'm sorry. The internal would be proposed to be allowed in GO, LB, HBGB, MRBS, E, LIGI, and MUS. Those are all Zs, so zoned by right. And then thank you, Brian. Thank you for pulling that up. And then you can see the P and the PB, which would be that planning board review that we recommended. And the reason there are two is because one was city and one was county, and we're recommending these standards for city and county. So does that help make sense?
Right. So, okay. So Mr. Bryan's version, the PB would change from a P to an E, as well as the LB.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
E meaning the elected body special use permit.
Correct.
Okay. All right. I got it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian.
And any other questions? Mr. Bryan?
Again, Mr. Chair, my goal in this was not to really limit this storage options, realizing that we need it and there are a variety of storage options, but to make it in a planful way fit in with wherever it is. I think there have been some wonderful suggestions that were brought up, and some were circulated by Mr. Steelman that were very practical in terms of trying to look at the area and how does this fit into an area with and still not limit it. I guess I've looked at it as planning storage can go into just about any area as long as it's done in a planful way. The other thing is leveling the field in terms of what the expectations are in no way diminishes, I think, at least, the opportunities for storage within our communities. And it really does. The other thing to be reminded of was that I am reacting from a PB area where I've lived and watched for over 40 years the type of development occur and the mistakes that we made with planning there that really did affect other development in that neighborhood. So for me, it's keeping a balance of trying to encourage development at the same time as encouraging this. Did the staff, Tiffany, find any quirks or whatever with my language or inclusions that might have unintended consequences that I would have missed?
Tiffany, I'll be glad to answer those questions if you pull up the slideshow for me. I'll tell you, Mr. Bryan, while she's doing that, for the most part, staff didn't really see any issues. Really, the only issue that I want to point out is this first section. Your proposed change relating to facades should be compatible in scale and rhythm with surrounding structures. If not held to another standard by surrounding structures, then it goes into the prescriptive standards. Since the majority of these storage buildings, with the exception of possibly PB and LB, would be reviewed by staff, I would hate for the staff to get in the situation where we might interpret a proposed storage building to be in concert and compatible with the surrounding rhythm of a neighborhood by picking up on different features, and then have a citizen or some other interested party say, no, I don't think this is the case at all, and then have to debate something that's really a staff level review. I think that we all understand the intent of that, but the way the language is written now, there may be some situations like that. And so I guess I'm fine. The staff is fine with that language being in there with that understanding. But if you all as a board are really concerned about the 100-foot length, it may be worth just reducing that number or changing the 25% so more of the facade has articulation. That's really just something that's a board decision, but I do want to make sure that everyone has kind of a realistic expectation of this is a staff level review, so there wouldn't be public input or anything.
Well, one of the things I was trying to do, Kirk, certainly in this, was to give the staff sort of a structure where they could negotiate with the developer. And I don't want to make that difficult for the staff in the midst of that. But the balance in what I was hearing was, how do we allow this to happen? Because the language works fine in an industrial area, something like that. There's or some other areas. But when you get into an area where a typical storefront area is very short, how do you use language that works in that situation that will also work in a more expansive development area?
So Mr. Bryan, I think, again, it sounds like your concern, as you mentioned earlier, is coming from a PB neighborhood, kind of an LB neighborhood. This language would make sense if those have E's next to them and they kind of go through that more formal process. And that would just kind of leave the more intense districts like the HB and the GB to where staff would be making those calls. Again, I think there's less opportunities for potential conflicts in those cases. So if the board is overall okay with that understanding, then it may be fine, the language as you've left it. And certainly we understand and appreciate the flexibility that you're trying to still leave in there.
Yeah. It's a toughie. Yeah.
I do have a question about that in particular. I think, George, I really like where you're going here. My question is, this almost points to design standards document, and we don't really have one of those unless I'm missing it somewhere. And I hear you. I think that you see it in a lot of codes across the country, but it's hard to apply it here, I think, just because of what Kirk said, in the sense of that could be up to interpretation of what I decide is rhythm versus somebody else. But I appreciate it. I just don't know the way we have it, our UDO currently, if we can just back this up.
Yeah, and I was thinking, I like where George is going as well. It is the language, I mean, I get it, but 5-10 years from now, and one of these cases comes up, our interpretation and the planner of the time and the community of the time may be different. I think with, as Kirk said, having the elected body approval will allow you to take into consideration the compatibility with the neighborhood and the community's concerns there, just because this language is not very definitive. And so it leaves a lot of question down the road. So if that is the concern, would it be better to, what I've been thinking all week about, to reduce the length for articulation. That way you are forcing more design-esque standards. I don't know what other people's thoughts are.
I would love to say that the thought of even a 75-foot blank wall in a PB district, to me, doesn't seem to address the intent we're trying to achieve. So I would fully support a reduction in those distances. With regard to which, I went out this week and took pictures and measured two such facilities. The one, oh great, thank you, Tiffany. These are the two, or at least this is two pictures of the. No, I'm sorry. On the top photograph, you're on Robin Hood Road, across the street from Lowe's grocery store, and when I also did measurements, the windows to the left of that entrance are 20 feet apart. The windows to the right of that entrance are 12 feet apart. I happen to think that's a very friendly, oriented design to a pedestrian. The photograph below that is out at the Robin Hood Village Shopping Center. From the left edge of that wall over to and including the corner where the windows are, that's 80 feet. And I can't imagine a facade of that distance in a EPB zone not having to have any articulation at all. So I would strongly support reducing, or no, let me say I would strongly support our consideration of either reducing those distances or eliminating it from being a permitted use in the PB zone.
So it sounds like between Mr. Farabee and Mr. Stillman in terms of that, Mr. Farabee, you're saying that, okay, it's difficult to judge this, but if we've got the elected body looking at it, which would put it into special use, then that's our ability to have that negotiated if it's something egregious. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's my thought. And then I was just saying, kind of, Ms. Stillman was saying that, maybe 100 feet is long, which it could be. So maybe it would be the facades greater than 100 feet in linear shall be articulated. Maybe it's facades greater than 75 shall be articulated.
Okay, so if I was amending and taking out the first part of that in yellow and changing that to 75, that would meet our goal with that. Not all of Mr. Stillman's goal in terms of not having it in PB, but what I'm trying to do is I think I heard one of the board members say that there are a lot of old structures that could be on the second or third floor, and it's no problem with me with that. You have retail on the bottom, you got other things, second, third floor, or even in the basement. Hey, that's what a great use for a building and way to get your money out of it. Okay.
Tiffany, could we go to the next slides and just go through all the language here? And this will be very brief. So this slide right here, this is basically the board's prerogative. We don't have any concerns about enforceability. Again, it's just a board question of whether you want it to go through the planning board process or the elected body process. Next slide, please. And again, staff doesn't have any issues with this. This is actually, this clarification that Mr. Bryan proposed makes sense, and it would be that little bit of extra clarification that would make sure that we aren't trying to get things that are related to the storage use on the first floor.
May I ask something there, Kirk?
Yes, sir.
Good, thank you. Most of these buildings are multi-story buildings. Is the intent for the required non-residential uses and non-storage related uses to occupy 50% of the total building square footage, or just that on street level?
Just that on street level.
I think that could be cleared up here by simply saying so.
So Mr. Steelman, I guess I would just ask, we have right now, these uses must occupy at least 50% of the interior space adjacent to the right-of-way. Would adding to that sentence, adjacent to the right-of-way at street level, answer what you're looking for there?
If adjacent to the street means the same thing, then I'm okay with that. I just didn't see it that way.
Yeah, and the reason we did it that way is depending on if you have a sloping site or things of that nature, street level may not be the first floor of the building from a kind of building code or inspection standpoint.
Okay.
I was going to comment, this brings some questions I had. If we're working to control the exterior view of the building to look a certain way, but we're also limiting that only 50% can be storage, then we're limiting what can go in and how it can look. So are we also sort of limiting what the non-storage facade is going to look like? If it can't be but 50% storage on the ground level, and that's the facade we're regulating, aren't we kind of regulating the non-storage use? We don't do that to other non-storage uses.
Frozen.
Have I totally confused everybody with my question?
I'm sorry, Ms. Smith. I wasn't sure if that was directed at the staff or if that was directed at your fellow board members. But from the staff perspective, it's kind of doing two things. As Mr. Steelman mentioned, it was addressing the aesthetics of the building at the right-of-way. But per Mr. Bryan's concern, it's also kind of addressing what goes on in that physical space. But a creative design could certainly balance both programs and have the transparent section of the building, for example, could be the non-storage use. So you could have a little cafe or a coffee shop on the ground floor in the transparent side. And then in the 75 feet that is non-transparent at the street level, then you could have the storage use and the things that didn't really need that transparency.
I'd like to hear some input from others as well as how economically viable the 50% of the square footage for is to start with.
Yeah, your first floor space is going to bring twice as much as your second and your third floor space. So it, from a pure self-storage facility perspective, but I'm really torn. I think we're making it complex, and I think that we're making it unclear, and I think we're making it very subjective with what we're doing, which on the one hand is great. I don't want any more storage units to be built. I don't want any more competition. But on the other hand, as a planning board member, I really like for us to draft stuff that's easily understood and is not subjective. I think rhythm, is a subjective term. I think there are a lot of things that the planning board can approve. I think that's really sort of our mission. That's why the elected body has a planning board or planning commission, is to have us make some decisions. And so I hate to add things to elected body approval. But I understand that there's a difference of opinion on that. But beyond that, beyond those comments, help me understand. I don't know why I'm having a hard time with just this B6B. All right, define staff. This is a question for staff, Tiffany or Kurt. Non-residential use. The non-residential uses must occupy at least 50% of the interior space adjacent to the street. What is, storage is a non-residential use, correct?
Well, that's why with Mr. Bryan's language here, that clarifies that was the intent all along, is that it would be non-storage. So
non-storage
things like, again, a coffee shop or a little retail space or even unrelated office use or things of that nature.
So the purpose, certainly one of the purposes of this CC11 is we want to build mixed use structures. And so we don't want just pure storage here. We want to see some retail or office. Is that the concept?
I think the intent was, as Mr. Steelman noted previously, in those PB districts to kind of activate the street, and by extension, some of those other GB and HB, the things that these internal spaces are going to be bumping up with other activity center and growth corridor type uses where there will be that activity.
Okay, and then a lot of storage facilities will have either, certainly most all of them will have some kind of truck rental type. With the truck rental component, usually they're almost separate businesses, and the storage complex is just an agent of one of the companies, one of the trucking companies. Would that be considered a non-residential use? Your storefront for your truck leasing or whatever. How would that be construed?
You could certainly make that case based on the way the language is written now, particularly if the entity had a different name. I mean, if it's Monster Truck Rental and that's just kind of a part of the Monster storage related business, it might be harder to make that case. But if it's, I don't know, if it's U-Haul has a space in there, that would certainly meet what you're talking about.
Okay, all right.
Just to clarify, this language that we're looking at is specific to the PB and LB districts. So, and with internal storage in these districts, outdoor storage of things like boats and RVs and that kind of stuff is not allowed. Having said that, one of the uses in the LB district that's allowed now is motor vehicle rental and leasing. So theoretically, because that use is allowed in LB, and again, LB is different from PB. You can, in LB, you can have your buildings further back from the street, et cetera. So theoretically, because that use is allowed in the LB district, they could have that additional use as part of this.
Thank you, Tiffany. That's a really good point.
So just for clarification, so with the original draft ordinance language, the assumption is that there's a non-residential use, like you just described. The proposed change, the yellow language is just kind of further describing the same thing, or that it would be non-storage. Am I correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so the assumption here is that in the PB, that these multi-story storage buildings would have a tenant or a different use that's just not storage, but maybe complementary, right?
Correct. And again, along that street level, along the street level there. So the upper stories could be solely storage, but some activation along the street level of other non-residential uses is what the aim is.
Okay.
So it looks like we've had a lot of discussion. It seems like, this is supposed to be an easy process for interpretation. I'm starting to get a little lost in all of this. So I'm wondering if others are going to get lost with the intent of what we're trying to do. That's my only question, because it's so subjective right now. I really don't know where we are. I think we have a consensus with the language now. Is that correct?
Well, you know, I think we've made it, if I amend what I said to get rid of that yellow in the first part, then we're not talking about being subjective. We're talking about the language that pretty much parallels what was there before.
That was in B6B, correct?
You've got me on the number game there, man.
B3.
This is B3.
B3, okay.
I think, yeah.
And so, Mr. Bryan, it would simply be changing that 100 linear feet in the staff draft to read 75 linear feet. And then presumably your motion would remain the same with the LB and PB going to the elected body and the extra language.
Right. So to get rid of that first part of the paragraph and start with facades greater than 75 feet in linear lift shall be articulated.
Which means if it's less than 74 feet, there's none required.
But you have an elected body which could say this doesn't work or this does work. And we have seen that happen time and time again, right? Then the way we have it now, it just be a planning board review. And my understanding of a planning board review and watching it over the years that I've been here is that as long as it fits the parameters, that's it. There isn't much we can do.
George, one question I have, if it goes to elected body, they still have to have something that they're judging it by. So we're still always going to have this sort of open thing. What is the elected body going to do? What standards is the elected body going to apply? So you're leaving somebody proposing this use still not knowing.
Well, remember that.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It wouldn't have negative effects on health, safety, and welfare. It would be compatible with the aesthetics and the character of the surrounding context. And I forget the specifics of the other one, but it's very similar to those kind of general parameters. And it's basically if a storage use was met affirmatively on those findings, then it would have to be reviewed, basically given approval. So it wouldn't be like a zoning case where the elected body could basically deny it for whatever reason. So someone would have to demonstrate why, for example, the proposed building wasn't meeting the rhythm of the adjoining property.
So if the descriptions that we have would come into play, but the actual implementation would be more site specific, because each PB is going to have its own character. Is that what we'd be trying to accomplish by sending it to the elected body, is to give the elected body the option of applying it case by case rather than trying to write one big description that fits everything?
Just in those limited areas where what my goal is, and I interpret it as our legacy goals, is we're trying to stimulate activity, encourage the neighborhood activity zones, encourage retail downtown, the walkability, all of those aspects that it would just in those two limited areas. And you know, it's getting more complex, because I like the trend that we're going where we're using more mixed use and stuff like that. But the more we do that, the more you're expanding the zoning areas that are walkable, that do have interaction, and that you're trying to encourage this activity in, and so I know we're going to go that direction further, but right now this is just very limited in PB and LB in my view.
All right. Are there any other thoughts or comments? Because there's no board action needed on this item.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. The board certainly has the option to go ahead and vote on this today. We've done that in the past for items where the board has closed a public hearing and then basically made their decision on the work session. But if the board wishes, they could continue this and make the decision at the July public hearing. So I'll leave that up to the board's discretion. But if the board is feeling like they're ready to make a motion now, we could certainly accommodate that.
Is anyone ready to make a motion, or do you want to?
I am, Mr.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Barnes.
So with the amendment of dropping that yellow paragraph and decreasing the length to 75, I would like to make the motion that we approve these changes to, what was it, CC
11.
11.
Motion by Mr. Bryan. Is there a second?
I'd like to second it, but I also like to make a comment. Is
Yes.
it appropriate for me to do that now?
Yes.
I'm a little torn by this as well. My big concern is with the LB. I mentioned that at the public hearing. I just don't like to see more activity centers become less walkable, because that, I think our goal, and the staff has continued to say that in our staff reports, that activity centers should be in compact mixed-use areas where walking is encouraged. And this is going to discourage that in those. I know Tiffany did the research. 5 activity centers have exclusively LB zoning. And then there's some that have mixed. So even in the mixed ones, we would be decreasing the walkability in those activity centers. That I don't like to see, and that's one of my concerns here. But I see this proposal as a compromise, as a reasonable compromise. I'm not as happy with the special use permit aspect of it because of the rigidity of the 4 findings of fact by which it's approved. But I can live with this. That's why I'm seconding this, and I see this as a reasonable compromise.
Melinda, I appreciate those comments, and I kind of feel like it's a compromise for some reasons as well, probably not quite the same ones, but as it is now, this use is not allowed. I think we've seen there's a need for it. There may be, we will find out if this is approved and it's an option. I'm not 100% positive about all of the aspects of it, but I think if we're going to move forward, there's going to have to be some compromise where we try something that can be a compromise or be reasonable and go from there, rather than, if we can't make up our minds, just not allowing it. That's not letting us have the input from the community either. Somebody will either take us up on it and try it, or they won't, because it's not going to be amenable to what's realistic. So for that reason, I would say it is a compromise as well.
There is a motion and a second on the floor. Is there any further discussion? Mr. Erickson, would you please call the roll?
Yes, sir. George Bryan.
Yes.
Melinda Dunnigan.
Yes.
Walter Farabee.
Yes.
Jason Grubbs.
No.
Clarence Lamb.
Yes.
Chris Leak.
Yes.
Mo McCray.
Yes.
Brenda Smith.
Ms. Smith, you're muted.
Yes.
And Jack Steelman.
Yes.
All right, Mr. Chairman, motion passes 8-1.
All right,
And that will go forward to the city council and ultimately to the county commissioners as well. And we'll let you know what happens there.
Thank you.
All right. Well, the next item on the agenda, hopefully it'll be a little easier lift for you all. It is another ordinance, but this one is related to the turkey shoot text amendment that you all at your last work session recommended to waive the fee on. Again, the UDO has a process for waiving fees for text amendments that the board thinks would be beneficial to the community. And believe it or not, we haven't amended our turkey shoot regulations since 1968. So they're probably about due. And David Reed has prepared the draft language on this. There's really only a few ordinance changes being proposed. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Reed and let him present that to you.
Thank you, Kirk. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I'll try and share my screen here and see if I can get that to share. And let's see. May have, there we go. Do you see the slide show up now?
No, sir.
Okay. All right, we'll try this once more here.
There you go.
Okay, you're seeing it now? Okay, good. And it looks like this is the end of the slideshow. Forgive me. I believe when I was practicing this, I ran through it and left it at the end. So we'll try one third time. Okay.
We got it. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you. Okay, so this is UDO-CC 13. The petitioner is Edward Nichols, and the request is to amend Section 542E of the UDO to amend the use conditions for the temporary use turkey shoot. As Kirk mentioned, the regulations were established in 1967 and have not been revisited since that time. The applicant proposed the text amendment after discussing his concerns with staff about the current regulations. Staff discussed with the applicant some possible changes to his setback proposal and notification requirement proposal, and the applicant agreed to the changes staff suggested, and the version we sent to you includes those changes. So the proposed changes are to change the minimum site size from 3 to 5 acres, increase the distance from the firing point to the property line from 200 to 300 yards for sites not using an earthen backstop, increase the side setback from a mere 20 feet to 200 feet, and to change the duration of the permit from 60 days with the possibility of 2 renewals to 60 days per year with no renewal within 1 year, within 365 days. Staff reviewed other turkey shoot provisions in surrounding counties, along with the current Forsyth County regulations related to the discharge of firearms and noise restrictions, and we found that these proposed changes are consistent with our surrounding counties and our county regulations. We also applied the proposed changes to existing properties in Forsyth County to study the implications, and found with this expanded side yards that a 5-acre tract is more conducive to fitting something on it than a 3-acre tract. In the recent past, permits for 2 sites have been granted for the use. One of those sites is in Walkertown, and they received permits each year from 2011 through 2017. And if this is passed, that site could continue to get permits because it's large enough to, the dimensions work for the new regulations. The other permit was granted last December 2020. That was on a 3-acre site, and it's very close to some existing occupied dwellings. If these amendments are made, that site won't be able to get another permit because it's too small. After reviewing this and working with the applicant, staff thinks these changes are appropriate, allow the use to continue, but it'll be much friendlier to surrounding property owners, and we do recommend approval. And I'd be happy to try and answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. Are there any questions for staff?
Mr. Reed.
Yeah, go ahead. You go ahead, George.
No, Mr. Reed, what's the definition of a turkey shoot?
The definition, I'll have to go to the UDO to get that. I know in our definition it is one of our temporary uses, but I'm not sure the extent of one of the requirements is that only shotguns can be used. But further than that, it's a contest where there's shooting occurring, and they're not shooting at, my understanding, at live turkeys. However, they're shooting at targets for the prize of a turkey. And beyond that, I would have to refer to the UDO to see if there's a more complete definition.
Well, I guess I should have called you up and asked for that, or maybe you can get it before next time, because, I mean, if we're talking about a turkey shoot, I have a certain opinion about a turkey shoot and been involved with them. And as I mentioned last time, you know, I generally look at turkey shoots as being run by something and being a charitable event that raises money that has a greater good. And that's nice. But if we're going to use the word turkey shoot, then somewhere I guess we need to have a definition. So what we're saying so a match or contest for prizes, usually a turkey or ham, at which participants fire handguns, rifles, or shotguns, but we're defining it just shotguns.
Correct.
So you change this definition as well?
That would be a good suggestion, Mr. Bryan. We could absolutely do that as part of the text amendment.
Okay, so it is a match or contest, but it doesn't define who runs it. It just says it's just a contest, because, you know, it's the same as the previous UDO we were talking about. You can look at these and you could say, okay, this is just a time to shoot guns and do it for a long period of time. And that figure of 200 feet being away, if you were doing it a whole lot, would be quite irritable to the neighbors, believe me, because I'm in an area where we do that. So I worry about that side area because I don't know what can happen with that. I'm also aware that a shotgun, when loaded properly, now most of these contests control the load. But our definition doesn't say that, but most contests provide the ammunition because you control the load so that no one has an advantage over another person when they shoot at the target. But a loaded shotgun that's loaded with a heavy charge can go 180 yards. Not 200 feet. So if a mishap or something goes on, it could, you know, pepper you. And I was just peppered the other day, as a matter of fact. So I'm really aware of that. And I was peppered at 200 feet, by the way.
Yeah, one of the surrounding counties does have defines the load that can be used. We could take a look at that and see if we could add the same load requirement as that.
I had a question.
I want to make it fair. That's the thing. Yeah.
Just to staff, to Mr. Reed, why you came up with that 200 feet. I know it's better than a 20 feet side distance, but what was about 200 feet that you thought was appropriate?
Well, the petitioner had a much larger distance side yard, and we felt that at some point, if you had to let them be able to use their property. So even if you go to 5 acres, you would need probably about 50 feet to do the turkey shoot area, and then 200 on either side gets you up to at least 450 feet if you did it within 50 feet. So that's going to be a pretty wide piece of property. So we didn't want to like leave some people with 5 acres, but they didn't have more than 450 feet of lot width. They wouldn't be able to do it.
To Dave's point, I think we kind of did some back of the envelope calculations to see what you'd need to meet the backstop or the distance without the backstop, I should say, and say 300 feet on each side. You're looking at something upwards of probably about 12 acres or so to do something like that. So it really throws a lot of properties out of the running for things. But again, that's certainly something that's available to the board to change.
Yeah, and there's also a county requirement that if you are near an occupied dwelling, you have to get written permission if you're within 300 feet of the dwelling. So we're talking about 200 feet from the property line, and then that regulation is 300 feet from a dwelling, which may be, you know, further than 200 feet away with the property line. You know, it probably isn't right on the property line. So the combination, it's similar to that requirement.
Okay, but just to be clear, 200 feet from a side yard, if you had a mishap with the shotgun, it could possibly stray into that neighboring adjacent lot. Maybe not the dwelling, but into the lot. Is that correct?
According to Mr. Bryan, I think he said he was 200 feet away and he was peppered recently. So.
Okay.
Are there any other-
Yes, please. Just one last small question for David. Does the written permission from the neighbor mean from the occupant or the owner if they happen to be different?
The language from the county states, no person shall, without the written permission of the current owner or lawful occupant of such property, discharge a firearm within 300 feet of a dwelling or other building or structure which is designed to be occupied by human beings. So I guess it's the owner or the legal occupant.
So it could be either one, Mr. Steelman, whoever they go to and seek permission.
Okay. All
Board
right.
members, this is an item for just briefing at this point. This will be
Right.
coming back to you for a public hearing on July 8th. And certainly, if any other questions come up in the meantime, feel free to reach out to Mr. Reed or myself or Aaron, and we'll try and get things squared away.
Please, and Mr. Reed, if you could maybe address Mr. Bryan's question via email and send that to us as well. That way that will kind of save some time on the July 8th meeting. Also, we can get some questions asked.
And that is regarding the load in the shotgun and changing it to shotguns only.
And I think he wanted an official definition as well.
Yeah. Yeah, we have the definition, but right now it includes other types of firearms. So we're thinking about changing that to shotguns only.
Okay.
And
We'll get that taken care of, Mr. Chairman, and send it out to you next week.
All right, thank you. Mr. Bryan, did I capture what you were asking?
You did. I am hearing this about the closeness, and I don't know how people are feeling about 300 feet now. That gives me a little bit more comfort level. It's, the way our county is developing, boy, Walkertown is just blowing up with development right now. And I'm assuming that the neighbors, when they move in, would understand what that could potentially mean to them in terms of noise.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Reed. Mr. Erickson, I guess we can move on to item 3.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is a action item, and this is adoption of the FY 21-22 Planning Board Work Program. You all may recall I presented some highlights at our May work session, and we just need to go ahead and have a board decision on that work program since July 1 next week. Hard to believe is the start of the fiscal year, and staff is ready to go out and do the work of the board in the community. So if you all have any questions about specific items, I'd be glad to answer them. But otherwise, we would need a formal vote on this.
Okay. Does anyone have any specific questions? If not, would someone like to put a motion on the floor?
I've got two quick questions. One is, did I overlook, or is there no work planned for the coming year for Beltway interchange plans?
So, Mr. Steelman, I can't remember if you were absent at the last work session where Steve Smotherman on our staff went through and talked about phase 2 of the Beltway plans, and what we were doing instead is
forgot.
Yeah.
Jack, did you have one more question?
The other is just a comment relative to a planning board support. I will ask again that we include in that effort board member training as is listed.
Yes, sir. And we've actually we've tried to accommodate that throughout the year with some speakers such as Mr. Owens from the Chamber of Commerce and Mr. Thiel at the April work session. And we've actually got a couple speakers slated for your July work session as well. So we're definitely trying to move forward on that.
All right, any other questions? If not, would someone like to put this to a motion?
This is Clarence, Mr. Chairman. Second.
I'm sorry, Clarence.
Nope, good.
Motion by Mr. Stillman, second by Mr. Lamb. Mr. Erickson, would you please call the roll if there are no additional questions?
George Bryan.
Yes.
Melinda Dunnigan.
Yes.
Walter Farabee.
Yes.
All right, that motion passes unanimously. And the next item on our agenda is debriefing of the June public hearing. So if any board members have anything they'd like to talk about, we can do that at this point.
I'd just like to thank the board members for last month's meeting. That was an extremely long meeting. So I think we did as well as we could with the length of time that we had. I think our minds were fried at the end. I want to thank you for letting me move some items to our work session so that we could get home. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very kindly. Anyone else have anything from the June 10th meeting?
I just wanted to let the board know that I did what I described as a very minority opinion to the city council following that, and shared it with Mr. King to share with the city council about the entertainment district, encouraging the city council to ask more questions and to get more definition from the staff about potential conflicts, not about the church portion, but about the school portion. Because having been a principal, having started a school in Winston-Salem, I feel like for younger children, the school really needs to have some control over the environment around it. And this is even with the understanding, as my child went to the downtown school when it was a charter school, and I realized how close that is in proximity to some of the things that could be defined as entertainment, but that we really need to look at some of those issues that are there. And I did not find the information that was given to us on that UDO change to help me understand what potential conflicts could be there, as well as wanting to see the entertainment district be as unfettered as possible so that the vitality of entertainment could have a big push because we're doing that entertainment district. So that was my very minority opinion.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I had a question about the case having to do with the Psi Delta House at Wake Forest, across the street from Wake Forest. Do you all remember that case? It was for
Very well. Yes.
Accessory building. I just did not understand some of the reasoning given by board members for not taking the documented complaints of the neighbors into consideration. You know, what I heard was that some board members felt like it was inappropriate to consider those concerns, those which were documented complaints that were a couple of pages of code violations. And that's an objective bit of information. So I've never seen us not take those things into consideration. This wasn't a quasi-judicial process, so it couldn't be a standing issue. I'm just trying to understand what the basis was for not considering those concerns legitimate in terms of our coming to a decision on a site plan amendment. I may be missing something. I just wanted to understand that.
would anyone like to mention that? I know there were some very strong comments from.
Because I know that Jason asked during the meeting, and I don't know if you were there, Kirk, but Jason asked Chris Murphy about the basis for coming to our decision. And Chris said, that we, and as we always do, take concerns of neighbors about impacts into consideration. But then when people were talking about their decision, it seemed like people were saying they felt that it was inappropriate to take those concerns into consideration. And here we had two presidents of neighborhood associations with their complaints. And I just felt like if why would we not take their concerns into consideration?
This is Clarence. I heard differently, and that's not, I'm not saying that's exactly what was said. I didn't hear that we didn't take the neighbors' concerns into consideration. I think we took a lot of things into consideration, but I may have missed or I may have forgotten exactly what said at the meeting. But I certainly took their complaints into consideration, but I also took into consideration the proximity of the property to the university and, things like that as well. So, but I may have misheard, or maybe I missed something that you heard.
Yeah, I
it
didn't
seemed
go
like
back.
the conversation was about the site plan amendment, and the use was already allowed. They had the zoning, and it was an amendment or change to the property. And so it would seem that, like if we were rezoning it, it may be a different conversation, because we would be able to take into consideration, the neighborhood in that issue. But because they have not, mixed well with their neighbors, doesn't mean that we can't allow them to do anything on the site, especially if it's already been allowed. So that was the way I took it, and the way that was my stance on it in the discussion earlier in the month.
I agree. Like, it almost felt to me that they did not want to pursue any, like they wanted to change what the zoning already was. It wasn't so much that the neighbors were upset that they were adding a building. They were upset that it was a fraternity house. And I think that we really needed to pay attention. Like, it was almost as if they wanted to downzone it versus that maintain the current zone. And that's, to me, where I felt the comments were driven from. I don't think that it's a disqualification of neighborhood input. It just felt like they wanted to change the use. And we were not in the position to do that.
Yeah, that Mo and Walter both very well summarized kind of where I was coming from on it, which was that it wasn't a zoning hearing. It was a site plan amendment. And so we weren't looking at whether the use as a fraternity house was appropriate or not. We were looking at whether the change to their site plan was in conformity with the ordinance. And my point that, Melinda, I think you're kind of asking where I was coming from, was just that we weren't in a position to make a decision about whether the zoning was appropriate or not. I certainly did take the neighbors' concerns and heard those and weighed those against the request and the standard we're supposed to use for the request. And, I'm empathetic to where they're coming from, but, it's, on the other hand, that fraternity house has been there, I'm willing to bet you, longer than just about any of the neighbors have lived close by. And it's kind of like buying a house next to a highway and then fussing about how loud the traffic is.
And Ms. Dunnigan, just to address your comment again, as Mr. Murphy stated, the planning board, just to be clear for future public hearings, absolutely has the right to have their decision be affected by and to consider public input. And it doesn't even need to be documented or quantifiable public input. That's certainly why we have public hearings on these things. And there there may have been things that in future cases, for example, even on a site plan amendment, if the board feels so moved that they may ask changes in a site plan to better address that. And that's certainly up to the board collectively at each case. But you're absolutely correct that there's no legal preclusion from considering public input.
Okay. So so this is going before council, what would happen, and this is beyond our scope, what would happen if the neighbors go to council and they vote and they say the same thing to council? What could potentially happen?
So basically the council has the same decision or the same process, I guess, that went on at the planning board level. The difference being that rather than a recommendation, they make the final yay or nay vote. So if council hears the testimony and shares some of the concerns that were raised by some board members, then they could deny it. And if on the other hand, they see it as just kind of a continuation of the use that's been there some time, just adding another building, they could approve it. So really the whole range of options is on the table at this point.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I was thinking. Ms. Dunnigan, did that answer your question?
Mr. Chairman, I believe Ms. Dunnigan temporarily was kicked off of the meeting when you asked that question.
Ms. Dunnigan, did that address your question? We can't hear you. I think she's having some computer issues. Ms. Dunnigan, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I did not hear the early discussion. Everything started freezing up on me.
Oh, okay.
So I heard Kirk say, does that meet your concern? But I don't know what it was that he was referring to.
So
basically, I was explaining that as you mentioned, you're absolutely correct in that the planning board can consider testimony from interested parties, and there's no concerns of standing or anything because, as you noted, it's not a quasi-judicial hearing, and it's really up to the board members on what they decide to do with that testimony. And certainly, folks will have an opportunity, as the chairman noted, to share that same testimony at the city council hearing on this item.
Right.
And I would just like to add that I hope when it goes to city council, that since one component of the council is a public safety committee, that this information be provided to them so that the use can be managed and controlled by the appropriate departments of city government.
Yeah, I just want to say, I from hearing, some of the explanations given, I think I understand a little more where people were coming from. It's just, I didn't want the impression to be given to the public that we are not taking their concerns into consideration. And I don't see a distinction technically because this is a site plan amendment. I think what is done in the amendment certainly needs to be reviewed for its impacts. And I think this was a decision that was, going to the question of impacts on the site plan. So I definitely think that that's legitimate to take into consideration.
So, just one other comment about sort of where we are procedurally. I get the need to debrief sometimes from public hearings to, clarify things and that type of thing. But I do think we're sort of heading down a slippery slope here if we're going to start taking every decision that this board makes and then dragging it back up at the next work session and asking everybody to explain why they voted a certain way. I think we're getting on kind of boggy ground there because we're never going to get anywhere. We're never going to get all the things done that we need to get done. And, sometimes people vote a certain way. I think we all tried to articulate why we voted a certain way during the public hearing. And I don't mind the clarification, but I bristle a little bit at being asked to defend a vote that I made when I explained why I voted the way I did during the public hearing. I don't think we want to start doing that every meeting.
No, I wouldn't propose that we do that. So I apologize if you think that that's the road I'm going down. I had just a legitimate concern about the reasonings that were stated at that meeting for the vote, which I didn't think I thought could be interpreted as not properly allowing citizen input in that case. And I was confused. So I do have more clarity now.
Okay. All right. Anything else from the June 10th meeting? If not, we'll move into the staff report.
All right, board members, I do have a few things for a staff report, but we'll be out of here pretty quickly, I think. So just to remind everyone, at your July public hearing is when we always have the election of chair and vice chair. So we'll do that at the beginning before the public hearing. Just to remind you all, it looks like we're going to have 2 zoning cases, 1 text amendment, and 2 subdivisions. So hopefully, fingers crossed, should be a much shorter meeting than last month. The last thing that I wanted to mention under staff report is, as you all are aware, things have been getting a lot better from the COVID-19 perspective in the community, and the board probably needs to start thinking about when you all are going to be holding your meetings in person again. The city council, my understanding is they're going to try and start going back to in-person meetings in August. So certainly that's something the board would need to vote on, but probably something that we need to take some action on pretty soon, just so if we do hold those meetings in person, we have enough time to advertise those appropriately.
Thank you. What I would like to say on that, having thought about this, we discussed it the last time, I think if city council is meeting in person, that we should do the same thing. I think that's just the right thing to do. So if we need to put that to a vote. Does anyone disagree with what I just said, first of all?
I have a question, Chris.
Yes.
On that. And as city council goes back and the world opens up, so does everyone else's world, and my travel opens up. Is there an opportunity, I can do this from a hotel room, is there an opportunity to do a hybrid option, right? So that if you're in person and able to be in person, wonderful. And I would not exercise it unless like I'm in South Carolina or in Atlanta in my territories, but the inability to be physically present does not preclude me from being present via technology. So,
I know we discussed that as to how that would look, and I know we've never come to a final decision. I think that's kind of above what we could do. Kirk, have you heard anything more on that?
So Mr. Leak and Ms. McRae, I haven't heard any more discussion about that. Just kind of hearing this today, I'll say that the concern that I would have is, again, is kind of touched on by the chairman, is how that would look like in terms of the technological aspects of it. How would we make sure that the folks in the audience could see a board member who was participating remotely, and kind of how that board member could interact with the other board members who were there in the person. That's certainly something that staff can do some research on and see what options are out there, but I don't have a good solution for anyone at this point.
And that is a great question, Mo. I know we had that happen at a Hall of Fame selection committee for Wake Forest. Some of us were there in person, and some of us were piped into the room on a screen. So I think it is up for discussion.
I would just add that, I mean, I fully support Mo's question, inquiry. I think it's something we do need to look very seriously at. When you look at the attendance rate of this board during the COVID era, it's incredible. I mean, we're struggling sometimes to have, quorum, and we've had almost 100% attendance at every meeting, and I personally don't feel like I've been constrained in any way. In fact, to be able to have 3 computer monitors up here, I know it looks like I'm looking around all the time, but I've got the agenda in one place and the presentation in another, and that's almost better to me. Certainly I think have a duty to be there in person when we can, but I don't think the argument that you can't effectively participate occasionally, and maybe we pass some kind of rule or policy that says a certain percentage or attendance has to be in person. I don't think Mo's proposing it as a hard and fast thing so much as just a way to deal with an exception occasionally.
I got some of these cashews that people, I got some in the mail, but I want to experience that in person. I would hate to miss it because I have to work travel and can't be there, but I can be there, just not physically. I'm present.
Mo, I think everybody agrees with you. Something that I've inquired about before, especially now that the world is opening back up. As Jason said, we've never had this kind of attendance in person. There have been many times, a couple times we couldn't have a meeting and vote because we didn't have a quorum. So, Kirk, if you don't mind, if you could check on that. I think we've heard those concerns, and I think they're valid concerns. But with that in mind, looking forward to August, would someone like to put the motion to the floor that we can start meeting in August?
Yeah, or do you want a motion that says we start meeting the same month that City Council does? I guess it's the same thing, but okay. Yes. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, this is Clarence. I would propose that we start meeting in person at such a time as City Council commences their in-person meetings.
Motion by Mr. Lamb. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Grubbs. Any further discussion? Mr. Erickson, would you please call the roll?
George Bryan.
Yes.
Melinda Dunnigan.
Yes.
Walter Farabee.
Yes.
Jason Grubbs.
Yes.
Clarence Lamb.
Yes.
Chris Leak.
Yes.
Mo McCray.
Yes.
Brenda Smith.
Yes.
And Jack Steelman.
Yes.
That motion is unanimous. And Mr. Chairman, I will talk to Mr. King about seeing what kind of information we can find. And it's probably going to take a little longer to address the hybrid approach resolution, but we will definitely get you back a report on that as soon as something comes available.
Sooner rather than later would be appreciated.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Thank you. Are you done with your staff report?
I am. Thank you, sir.
All right. Anything else for the good of the order?
Well, we have a motion to adjourn and hope everybody gets out to enjoy the rest of this beautiful day we've got today.
Everybody have a happy 4th of July. We won't meet before then.
Happy 4th.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.